Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to call to order the meeting of the Planning Commission of the City of Half Moon Bay for Tuesday, this would be January 28th, 2020. Could we begin with a Pledge of Allegiance, please? Thank you. Could we have a roll call, please?
All right, Commissioner Holt?
Here.
Commissioner Polgar? Here. Vice Chair Reddick?
Here.
Chair Benjamin?
Here.
And we note that Commissioner Hernandez is absent this evening.
His place will be empty. So the agenda looks pretty short. Any proposed changes, or are we all good with the way it looks? Seeing no objection. Then the first item on our agenda is the approval of the minutes of January the 14th, 2020. Are there any corrections or additions to these minutes? Brian? That would be.
Oh, I think we just had the correction underneath the election of chair and vice chair. It says nominated and accepted. I think that should be accepted, ACC.
Thank you. Any other changes?
That I'll move to approve.
Before we take a second, I just wanted to ask whether the commission would clarify one particular motion, and that was with respect to a deviation from the original suggested motion for maintaining the triplex. The motion was to remove the parking for duplex and triplex, and the motion was a little bit vague about that, and I believe the intention of the commission was to retain the visitor parking requirements in the duplex and triplex area. And I just wanted that to be very clear in the motion should it ever come up. With that in mind, maybe we can get a second with that change if it's acceptable to the maker.
I'll second.
And it's okay with the maker to make the change? Absolutely. Okay. Any other comments? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, thank you. Then we move on to the next item on our agenda. This is the oral communications or public comment time for our meeting. This is a period where any item that is of interest to the public, except the ones that are actually on the agenda, we're very interested in hearing from you about. So if you have an item you would like to address to the commission that is not the study session for short-term vacation rentals, this would be the right time to have that conversation. So I'm going to open the oral communications. Seeing none, I'm going to close the oral communication. And we'll continue with the next item on our agenda, which is the study session for short-term vacation rental land use regulation. And the staff report will be given by Scott and Jill, Team Half Moon Bay.
And Joe Butcher. All right, good evening. We have a technology glitch, and they're going to keep working on it, but we can begin without the presentation and just introduce this item. This is a study session. This is not meant to be coming forward with a fully cooked ordinance whatsoever. We've wanted to make a note that we've received 4 written comment letters or different kinds of communications in advance of this meeting. They've all been provided to the Planning Commission. If anyone else had anything in writing that they wanted to prepare or convey to the Planning Commission, just let us know and we'll make sure they have it. Just a few quick thoughts before we dive into the land use side of this topic. What's the current city practice? What's the status of short-term vacation rentals? We call them STRs. You'll see that abbreviation in our slides in my hopes that they pop up eventually. They will. All right, sounds good. Good. Faith is good. All righty then. So currently, Half Moon Bay does not have any specific land use controls for short-term vacation rentals. The status is that the city requires a business license, and we do collect transient occupancy tax, which we refer to as TOT, and That has been going on for several years. Folks want to know how many short-term vacation rentals are in the city. That's always a hard question to answer because they go up and down from time to time, really reflecting on how flexible the land use is for people. They can choose when it's a good time for them to have their home available for having a guest and when they don't want to do it. So I think our most recent spot check was only about 45. We've had a lot more in other times that we've checked in. Of course, this is off season, so we wouldn't expect to have as many right now. And people also want to know, well, gosh, you're collecting that TOT, how much money is that? And I think the first year that we were really able to dig into that and track it, we only got about $80,000. In the last fiscal year, that would be 2018, 2019, it was on the order of 200,000. So that has been really a result, not necessarily of having more short-term rentals, so much as just better systems, communication. The city now has an agreement with Airbnb, which is helpful to us. We have a compliance specialist who tracks our short-term rentals. That's really common. Almost all the cities have that. And there's a number of firms that do that. And we believe that most of them are in compliance with those requirements of having a business license and paying their TOT. Now, putting all that aside, because that's not land use, and that's not what we're focused on tonight. Tonight we're focused on short-term vacation rentals as a type of land use that could happen in different neighborhoods, or the way we think about it with our planning commission, different zoning districts. And this is a relationship of a suite of land uses that you might see, for example, in the R1 zone, which is going to emphasize single-family residential and a pretty tight array of possibilities for other uses in that zone, but that zone is mostly reserved for single-family housing. There's other zones where short-term rentals can happen. Look at that. Absolutely. Thank you. We don't know what happened, but we appreciate that, Bridget, very much. We also have mixed-use zones where this could occur, and you'll have a much, much longer list of uses that could occur in those areas. So there's a lot to think about from that land use perspective. And we want to get right to what you're really going to be talking about tonight then from your study session. Your packet, first of all, included a policy background paper that was your March 2018 staff report that covered a full range of policies. It's taken us a while to get back to you because we have been really busy with ADU ordinances and other codes in the land use plan, and of course other applications going on. So we're glad that we were finally able to come back on that, but that paper is still important, as are the Coastal Commission documents that were attached to your report. One is a guidance document from the Coastal Commission about regulating short-term rentals in the coastal zone and being mindful of responsibilities around coastal access and not being overly restrictive, while also at the same time paying attention to context and compatibility. And they also, in May, it was great that they did this. I think it's attachment 3. There's that table of all of the Coastal Commission actions. That was not available when we saw you in 2018. We actually kludged together our own version of that. That's a great table. It shows everything they've ever looked at with short-term rentals up and down the coastal zone. And we'd encourage you to really focus in on the most recent, probably 5 years, where they've really been kind of developing their intent with these and recognizing that they operate differently in different cities, and different cities may already have a lot of lodging or camping or other kinds of options, and some don't. And so this is an opportunity for a type of lodging that people find highly desirable, and it works really well for some of the hosts. And we're sorry that it's like 4-point font. I would recommend that you look at it online. We have it posted on the city website, so it's a lot easier to see there. So in picking this back up, we recognize that there's been a gap in time since we've specifically talked about this item, although you've discussed it in policy discussions for the land use plan update. It came up in the coastal access and recreation chapter. It came up in the development chapter of the land use plan. It's also come up head on in the work that we've been doing on the accessory dwelling unit ordinances. So it's always sort of been on a side burner, so to speak, as opposed to a back burner. But to reintroduce this to our community and to come to you with some new information, we wanted to engage in some outreach, and recognizing that this item has a lot of interest across town, and there's no one perfect way to get everybody's opinion. Workshops are great, but sometimes we can only, as hard as we try, get 40 people, 50 people. So we decided to do a survey. We understand it is not statistically significant. We aren't going to be able to do that. But we were happy to get 175 responses. This is similar to some work that the city's been doing recently with other surveys on Carter Park and other projects that we've been doing. And it's just a good start. It gives you a sense. It's taking the temperature, and in no means is it the whole picture and everybody's opinion. We also wanted you to know that it was up for quite a while, and the questions were meant to really flesh out some components of short-term rentals that I'm going to turn this over to Joe Butcher in just a minute. He's our community preservation specialist. Joe and I hear most of the complaints, and so we wanted to make sure that we understand the complaints so you can figure out how to facilitate the use. And that's where the questions were coming from, and we can talk about them a little bit more and the intent behind them if any of them strike a chord with you or you had questions about the questions. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and let Joe present just a high overview of the results of the survey.
Thank you. As Jill said, we did administer a survey that was out there for about a month in time, trying to get as broad of a net and wide variety of responses as we could. I'm not going to go over all 11 questions. I think that's a little unnecessary. We do have this available on the website as well as in our Planning Commission packet, so all the survey questions and results can be viewed at any point in time today or after the meeting. Going forward, I wanted to look at our first question as just kind of for our summary of results, is just talking about who participated in this. And we found it pretty interesting that, 90%, approximately 90% of the people that participated are Half Moon Bay residents, with the other larger number being that over 70% are homeowners here in town. So that's pretty significant. It kind of shows, that for those that have participated, they're paying attention, and these are likely people that are operating or interested in operating one. So that's a pretty substantial number right there for the turnout. What's not pictured here, but again is available, actually I'm gonna go back. What's not pictured here, but is again available on our website, is we had an option here for question 2 to go over all the different neighborhoods in which you live, so we can get an idea of who's taking the survey. And we got a little bit of participation from every single one of the neighborhoods, but where we got the most turnout were predominantly all of our western neighborhoods. So as you can see a pattern there. Moving on, I just kind of wanted to go over really quickly just a quick definition of hosted versus non-hosted, and we'll get into this a little bit later whenever I turn it over to Scott a little bit more in detail. But hosted is a renter will rent out a room or multiple rooms of a house, but still also occupy the rest of the residency. Unhosted typically would be whole house, so somebody would rent an entire home where there isn't somebody on site for management purposes. That being said, with what we found in these results for if short-term rentals are allowed, where is it the most appropriate use? And it was interesting to find that for mixed use and for downtown, we seem to get a relatively positive response of approximately almost 65% of the persons are supported to hosted, as well as over 50% of persons are supportive of unhosted in the downtown mixed use area. So that was a pretty substantial finding. That being said, we also have some similar consistencies here for mixed use and, for multifamily, duplexes, condos, and triplexes. You can see about close to 60% of the persons are supportive for hosted, whereas 35%, closer to the 40% range, have their reservations about unhosted, but are still supportive. And as well as in a single-family home, we've got over 60% that are supportive for hosted, and 39, close to 40 again, for unhosted. Now, this one I find to be pretty significant. If you're not supportive in allowing short-term rentals in Half Moon Bay, would you be more supportive if they're hosted? Now, we've got 30% that absolutely they're supportive, and we've got the 27% that are just against, they're just not supportive for it. But then we have the 40% that they're not really picking and choosing between hosted or unhosted, because generally they're supportive for short-term rentals. So I mean, that's about 70% of the surveyors, the people that have taken the survey, that are in support of short-term rentals. This next slide is actually, I'm not going to dive too deeply into this. This is just kind of an overview of options that we put on this survey for performance standards. And it's pretty standard with all jurisdictions that have regulations for short-term rentals to implement some of these performance standards. For limits on length of stay, again, we'll get into that a little bit later into this presentation, but that's something that staff is not going to recommend, and we'll address that a little bit more. But it's pretty standard across the board for the regulations to take into consideration noise, parties, insurance, things like that. We just have it on there, that way people, as you can see, where people are mostly interested are pretty standard. And lastly, this is just an overall summary. So after I went through and checked out all the responses, and we got the positive, the negatives, we also had the 88 comments. And what was interesting about the comments is they kind of went all across the board, and we found that about a third of the responders are in strong support. There was little comment to no comment beyond just saying yes. And about a third of those on the opposite end that had strong reservations for them in Half Moon Bay. But the other third were all fairly supportive still, with just taking into consideration some varying degrees of regulations. Again, all 88 comments are available to the public, so they're on our website, they're in the packet, you're welcome to read through them, and they're on attachment 5 of the staff report. And with that, I'm going to turn it over now to Scott, our associate planner, who has got a little bit more into the high-level decision matrix. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe, and nice to see the Planning Commission this evening. So one key thing that we're hoping to get feedback from the Planning Commission on is what makes sense for short-term rentals and what land use in our city. Generally speaking, people view short-term rentals as more of a single-family type thing, but it's certainly possible to have them in multifamily, and we've talked a little bit about our mixed-use zoning districts. Does it make sense to allow short-term rentals within our mixed-use zoning districts, downtown, commercial visitor serving, possibly even commercial general for a future project that may have a residential component to it. And then what type of residential unit? This is another thing that the Planning Commission, it would be helpful to get feedback on. what type of units, single family or triplex, duplex, maybe even within our mobile home parks, mixed use. Planning Commission did touch upon this when reviewing the draft ADU ordinance, and so that's really not up for discussion this evening as far as allowing short-term rental in accessory dwelling units. That's already been addressed within the ADU ordinance. Now, as far as the types of short-term rentals, we've kind of, Joe talked about this a little earlier, that there are two major distinctions. The hosted, where you have a homeowner that actually lives on site and occupies the most of the space within a home, and then rents out maybe a bedroom or two as a short-term rental. Now, certainly, as you saw in the survey, there's general hosted short-term rentals are generally supportive in Half Moon Bay, and typically, in our survey of other cities, usually not a limitation on the amount of nights per year that someone can short-term rental as a hosted option. Other things to consider, provide supplemental income to the homeowner, low-cost housing as a vacation rental to folks coming in, and we haven't really received any complaints on hosted. Now the other flavor, unhosted, this is where a homeowner does not live on the site and rents out the entire residential unit as a vacation rental. The survey, we did receive a wide range of responses. Jill and Joe have received some complaints, here and there on unhosted short-term rentals within the city. And regulations vary widely, from city to city throughout California. We see everything from prohibited outright to limiting to a certain number of days per year, up to allowing them as much as possible. So some other regulations to consider, the primary residence. There are cities that allow a renter to actually sublease, a room as a vacation rental. That's something that we're certainly going to want to address within the new ordinance. Other things, TOT and business license that we currently require. Do we have a limitation on the on-call management? How far away can they go when they're short-term rentaling out their residential unit? It's very common in our survey of other cities to limit the amount of occupants to a room to 2. That's pretty consistent throughout the cities. And then performance standards. This is something that the new ordinance is going to need to address as well. Noise limitations. Do we increase the noise limitations beyond what we currently have in our noise ordinance? We recommend that the new ordinance actually require parking on site, 1 parking space within the driveway. Certainly wouldn't, that would be very reasonable, to require that within our new ordinance. And then, let's see, I think this is, I'm going to now turn it back to Jill.
Thank you. A couple notes on the slides that Scott was just covering. Attachment 7, I think it is, of your staff report includes a matrix within a column with room for you to take notes on these different topics if it's helpful to you. We found it to be helpful in previous sessions when we're looking at different combinations of codes. So I'm taking this slide because it's really important for everybody in the room to understand that there's quite a few short-term rentals operating in Half Moon Bay right now, and this is just a discussion about going forward into the world of having some land use regulations around them with what staff believes is that the intent is to allow them to be successful and to be compatible and a comfortable use throughout Half Moon Bay's different neighborhoods. But if land use regulations come into place, it's likely that some of the ones that are operating now might not fit within the bounds of those regulations. So we're going to need to learn more about that and what options we have for working with folks who might have that going on. This is speculation right now. We don't know if you're even going to want to adopt a short-term rental ordinance for land use controls. But if you do, we will need to really think about a grace period or some kind of a transition time for that. We would also need to use some kind of a grace period for the after-the-fact permitting that we imagine would need to happen. So we'd really want to have everybody come in and get their short-term rental part of the system so that we know where it is and everybody can show us, yes, we've got all these boxes checked, whatever those boxes are that you would set up in your code. And just a couple notes about that. We are not interested in monitoring short-term rentals on a high-touch way. We aren't interested in inspecting them on a regular basis. This is about starting up. I have seen short-term rentals that do not meet fire codes. We don't want that to happen. We want to catch that. It isn't to shut them down. It's to correct the conditions so that they can operate safely. The whole intention is to facilitate these in an appropriate manner. So that's the idea about a grace period and after-the-fact permitting and thinking of a really business-friendly approach to helping these businesses kind of come into the rowing along with whatever ordinance we may end up with. We will also need to have some kind of process for how to deal with code violations. They do come up. We've mentioned it a few times. We do get complaints. We don't get a lot of complaints. I don't want to overplay that, yet we have also heard people talk to us about their concern about what they're seeing with short-term rentals in their neighborhoods, and they won't call anybody out because neighbors like each other and they want to keep their neighborhoods happy with each other. And so this is something that we recognize is part of the culture here, which is it's really very nice, but it makes it hard to maybe confront something that's been a problem. And so we're hoping that these kinds of performance standards are aligned with people's expectations for how their neighborhood would be affected or hopefully not even noticeable to have short-term rentals in it. But we would have to have some kind of really fair and clear process. What Joe and I like to do with code violations is we seek voluntary compliance. We don't even like to write them up unless we have to. We just like to let folks know what needs to get fixed, and 90% of the time it gets fixed, and that's kind of great. So this isn't a focus on that negative side, but we know some people are worried about that, and you will, if a code comes forward, you will see some language about that because you have to have that kind of process. All right, so then we also were hopeful that people noticed that in the staff report, we called all of these initial suggestions, and we are not coming in this room with hard sell staff recommendations tonight. So again, reminding kind of the tone of what we hope this discussion is about. We do have this context of what you've already thought about in your staff report and Coastal Commission guidance. We talked slightly about complaints, but we do want to remind everybody about kind of some of the nuts and bolts of zoning. We note, in addition to a couple people who took the survey and didn't like the survey, and of course the survey is trying to get opinions, and we got some opinions about the survey in addition to about short-term rentals, and that's okay. We learned from that too. But there were some comments about, well, gosh, how in the world can you put land use controls over what somebody is doing in their home? And it's a great question. Short-term rentals, like so many other we see them as akin to a home occupation, require a business license. And in fact, home occupation standards are codified. They're actually really, really strict. And in fact, I think they're a little too strict. We've talked about that in open forum a few times, and we'll talk about it again. But that's part of how businesses are happening in neighborhoods now, and you might not realize how many are in your neighborhood. I've been a contractor working out of my own house. I had to pull a business license and check all those boxes and make sure that I was conforming to how much of my home I was using and all of that. So this is pretty part and parcel in terms of what the intent of a particular zoning district is for. And so this is really context for how short-term rentals might fit into that. And then your staff is especially interested in how short-term rentals can they kind of have a tension with respect to housing. They can really help people supplement income and stay in their homes. We've heard some great stories about that. But if they are whole house rentals for a lot of weeks of the year, without having a occupancy, a primary residence requirement, oftentimes that unit is no longer part of your housing stock. It's really used for other purposes. So we just note this taps into all kinds of things that you've been working on through land use. Some of the key questions, the variations that we see that are really all over the board. You heard Scott present this. How many nights per year for unhosted? San Mateo County unincorporated allows 180. Santa Cruz allows 30. We saw all kinds of examples. You'll see that in the Coastal Commission summary table. And so that tends to be something that folks gravitate around in working on these kinds of regulations. Requiring primary residency can kind of dull the need to do that if there's concern about that, but we just want to note about that. We're interested, of course, in your thoughts on the whole thing, but variations for zoning, downtown mixed use, we've been talking about mixed use zoning for a while. We know that lots of different uses can work together downtown. You might want to consider different regulations for mixed use areas. You also received a letter about the PUDs, and PUDs have homeowners associations. I believe in particular Ocean Colony has been regulating short-term rentals through their CCNRs, and they like what they're doing apparently from the letter that I've seen. It's a little, I've heard from them over the years, and I've been hearing different things, so it's great that they've come out and shared this information with you, and it's if they're able to regulate them without Joe and me getting complaints and having to go code enforce them, we're pretty happy about that, actually. So we have a really open mind about how you might consider those things. There were a few regulations that we want to, and I'm almost done, but we just want to note we did not recommend these 3 things, and there's very specific reasons why. First of all, we're not recommending having, and these are recommendations at this point for us, and we're open-minded and we'll adjust, but we would prefer to not have a discretionary permit process for this. We would really like to have this process set up in a way that it's it's easy to be successful because it's so clear and you can comply with it. The other two are really interesting things that we've seen going on in other cities. Some cities try to limit how many they have in their city as a whole, or they try to have a concentration limitation. So for example, they require a certain amount of spacing between short-term rentals. We're concerned about that for multiple reasons. One is I just don't think we can monitor and enforce it. And two is that flexibility that we talked about early on, where, hey, I want my short-term rental up right now, and no, actually this summer I'm gonna garden all summer long and I don't want anybody in my house. So if somebody's choosing to not use it and they've taken one of the spots, it's making it so somebody else who's available to provide that and might need the income or really wants to have that business opportunity, they can't do it. So if your regulations are working well enough, we would hope, and we would, frankly, kind of seems like it is working out, that the concentration and the total number could be managed over time because they're moving around, and we're not seeing them super concentrated. Now, we may hear differently tonight. That's why we're here. So that was our initial take there. And then minimum stays. This is a concern for staff for long minimum stays. Some cities have wanted 7-day minimum stays. And in some cases, maybe longer, I'm not sure, but 7 is one that keeps coming up. That just doesn't work for the intent of having a low-cost option, especially in the hosted type. A family who needs a low-cost lodging might not be able to afford a 7-night vacation. We really think that is a prohibitive kind of condition, and it could also really limit what somebody might do as a host to have folks stay in their home over a weekend. So we're not encouraging that. We're happy to explore it. We're happy to do more research on it, but we think it's pretty hard, and it would be really hard to track and enforce, and we don't know that it's really worth it. So just for the good of the room, the way that we have study sessions in Half Moon Bay is our planning commission will take this back now from staff, and they will ask us clarifying questions if they have any, and there'll be plenty of time for public comment and discussion, and then we'll talk about next steps when we're at that point and done. So thanks for listening. We appreciate how many people turned out tonight.
Thank you for the staff report. So certainly have a large audience for this evening, and I know we all want to hear from them, but before we do any of my colleagues have some clarifying questions that they'd like to put to staff? Brian?
Just a quick question. There's a couple things in here regarding ADUs, and the recommendation is 0 nights in accessory dwelling units, and that comes from our accessory dwelling unit ordinance, correct?
That's right. And in 2018, the city has a new certified accessory dwelling unit ordinance, and of course, we're working on an update as well. At that time, those short-term rentals that were operating in compliance with the city's TOT requirement and business license requirement that were operating out of accessory dwelling units were grandfathered by that code. We believe it's fewer than 10, and that grandfathering clause has stayed in place, even in the draft code. But other than that, no new ones, and none of the ones that hadn't been operated before as short-term rentals. And the intent was, of course, that ADUs accessory dwelling units were meant to be supporting housing needs, and they are a reaction to the housing crisis in terms of how liberal the standards are, and the standards weren't made liberal to provide for short-term rentals. They were to be housing.
Steve?
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. If these go beyond clarifying questions in scope, let me know and I'll hold them for later. Does the process of getting a business license today, is it specifically for short-term rental?
So it's actually a general business license. So no, it's not specific to AD or short-term rentals, but the transit occupancy tax is. So
I'm just wondering if that's a mechanism for more accurately counting the number of short-term rentals in the city.
at this point, no, because there are short-term rentals out there that don't have business licenses, so not yet, but eventually.
And the term after the fact permitting, does that mean the same thing as getting a business license?
Sort of. So a business license is a tax as opposed to a permit, so it's a little bit different.
Okay, thanks.
Sarah? Nothing right now? So a couple of questions before we go into the hearing. If I understood the staff report correctly, when I read through the Coastal Commission feedback, they were reminding us that they regarded the institution of short-term rentals as a change in the intensity of use, and that they required a coastal development permit. I noticed in the key questions, or maybe it was a recommendation, that we were saying you were suggesting as an opening position that we not view these as discretionary permits. And I'm just trying to figure out whether those are conflicting recommendations or there's a powerful distinction between the coastal development permit, which is not ministerial, which to me means it's probably discretionary, or some other kind of discretionary permit.
Yeah, I noticed that as well in the Coastal Commission letter, and my assumption is that there would be a CDP that would be required for a program for these types of permits, but I think we might want to look in a little bit more detail to whether the Coastal Commission had something else in mind in terms of actual CDPs every time someone came in order to authorize an individual.
Okay.
So I think it's a good question that will require a little more research.
Okay, that's a great answer. And then with respect to parking, I appreciate the recommendation, or I'm not endorsing, I noticed the recommendation with respect to providing some amount of off-street parking associated with STRs. These are visitors, and public streets are, especially near the beach, are considered fair game for visitor parking. And so I just want to try to get clarification. In my mind, this is the visitor who's in an STR may be competing with the visitor who needs daily use parking, and that's the reason that it makes sense for us to advocate for some off-street parking, or do I not have the right framework for thinking about this?
We thought about quite a few things in the parking world, and one of them was also because of accessory dwelling units, we can hardly require parking for them anymore, that we're anticipating neighborhoods to be struggling a little bit more with parking over time. So also akin to the the home occupation ordinance, where we're also looking at being consistent about parking for this kind of use. So we also thought about this as coastal access. That's true too. There's a lot going on there.
Okay.
Yep.
So if there are no other questions, I'd like to hear from the public, probably the wisest part of our team. The way it works is there's a podium. I have some green sheets here that people fill out, and I call you by name. You go to the podium, and we ask you to try to conclude your comments within 3 minutes. If someone has said something that you already agree with, you can say, I agree with Mr. Smith or the last speaker. We are anxious to hear your thoughts. If you want to speak but you haven't filled out one of these, that's okay. You can come speak. I'll invite anybody who wants to speak to raise their hand and be recognized. At the end, if you could fill out one of these green sheets, it'll help us do a good job with the minutes. Okay? So with that in mind, I'm going to open, I think this is a public hearing, so I'm going to open the public hearing, and I'm going to invite the erstwhile Tim Pond to the podium. And he will be followed by Matt Detome. I hope I did not massacre that.
My name is Tim Pond, and I live over on Potter. And first, I'd like to address the parking situation. I live in probably one of the busiest beach areas. And yes, there's a crowd coming for parking, but there is rarely a parking problem in our neighborhood. And I hear calls of parking, and I really think it's a problem that at this point does not exist. And that people that don't want parking just don't want people to come into their neighborhood. So that's just a feeling that I get. I've hosted Airbnbs for 3 years or so, had probably 1,500 guests at my house, 1,000 reviews, most of them positive. Forward some to my mother. She's very happy with them too. It helps my house be affordable. I'm a superintendent for a construction company. I design accessory dwelling units as well as a side business. And it helps me live in this neighborhood with people that make way more than me. It provides me with money to send my kids to college and live a normal life and pay my taxes on my house, which are over $10,000 a year since I remodeled it. I'd like you to think of Airbnbs also as a distributed hotel. There's a lot of people that are against hotel development, but you can actually look at this as a hotel that's distributed out with no further infrastructure involvement. And it's a very, and then the final thing I'd like to say is just about the people that I get. Tonight I have a woman who's been at my house for about 30 days. She's taking her medical boards. She's a student. So she's can't afford to come to California and do this any other way. So that's like a typical guest. And then older people, a lot of people come with dogs, people that are financially unable to stay in hotels and don't want hotels. They want a softer place to live in a nice, quiet area. And so, and a lot of elderly people too. I've hosted a lot of people, and they're my age and older, that come to the coast and really prefer Airbnbs to other types of housing. So let's see, what else we have? And the dog-friendly thing is another thing too. A lot of people travel with their dogs, and most hotels ban dogs over 10 pounds if they're German Shepherds or any other kind of dog they can't come to the coast. And dogs are a large part of people's lives, and so I invite pets to come to my house too, and they find it really enjoying. But I would say that unhosted Airbnbs primarily do not need to be regulated at this point, and that they're not a problem. And that the specter of hordes of Airbnb hosts coming to town and turning our town into this nightmarish place where people are renting out every room and turning their houses into de facto hotels hasn't happened, isn't happening, and won't happen. And that we're going to maintain a small community here of beach rentals like we've had for 1,000 years of people going to the beach.
Thank you. The next speaker is Matt Detome or Destom. I apologize if I've said it wrong either. All right. Detome, très bien.
Detome. Thank you very much. My name is Matt Detome. I've been here for 10 years, friends with a couple people on the Planning Commission. I've been renting a small 13 by 20 foot cottage on my property for about 3.5, 4 years. And by the way, I'd welcome anybody to come to that property. If the Planning Commission wants to talk to me, see the results, you guys are welcome to come check it out, see what the situation is. I own that house. I also have a cottage in the back, and there's a 3 2-bedroom in front that I rent to Cynthia Sherrill, who does the CERT. So I chose not to rent both of those units on a short-term rental basis because I thought it would be overburdensome to my neighbors. I prioritize my neighbors before my guests. I screen every single guest that comes into my house. I am friends with my neighbors on all corners, and I love my neighbors, and those people come first before my guests, and they will always come first before my guests. Let's be clear. People have rented homes on the beach for thousands of years. From the Roman ages to today, they've rented homes. It's not a new thing, right? VRBO's been around for 20 years. You know, back when I was in college and high school, we rented VRBOs by the beach all the time. So, you know, and I did the math when Jill said that there was 45 units here. We have about 12,000. How many single-family homes here? Maybe 4,000, something like that. I mean, we're in the less than 1% or close to 1%. Let's be clear that we're not a solution looking for a problem, right? I mean, I don't know how many complaints, but we should quantify that to make sure that we are actually addressing things. I think the study here is perfect. I too want a neighborhood. I too don't want hordes of Airbnb guests. My son runs and plays in the neighborhood that we're in right now. I know that all of our kids do. And so I think the common sense regulations that we're talking about, let's root out the bad actors, maybe even put a council together of 4 Airbnb hosts that have been around for a while, plus one person from staff, and let's come up with common sense kind of blocks and tackles so we can all continue to enjoy the income from short-term rentals. My wife heads up Young Actors Workshop. She's the president of the Young Actors Workshop here. Volunteer basis. She does a lot of stuff in the community, supports Hatch and Seacrest auctions. She does this because we make some money on Airbnb and we don't have to send her to work. So I think all in all, it's an awesome opportunity for us to make money, enjoy the coast, and interact with neat people. And I agree with what Tim says. My neighbors down the street that have 2 ADUs have 6 cars.
If you could
in front of
wrap
their
up your
house.
comments, please.
My Airbnb unit, they come with 1 car. They don't come with 4 additional cars. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ditton. The next speaker will be Dave Olson, followed by Marta Portobello Swego. Welcome, Mr. Olson.
Thank you. I'm Dave Olson. I live in El Granada. I'm a council person on the Mid-Coast Community Council, but I'm speaking as a private resident.
If you could move a bit closer to the microphone, it'll help
Move
us
a little
hear
bit
you.
closer. Okay.
Perfect.
Unfortunately, I did not print this out on a piece of paper, so I'm going to have to go back and forth. I worked on the County of San Mateo short-term rental ordinance. It probably would not be in existence if I had not been working
You've
on
gotten
it.
away from it again. You can bring the microphone closer to you.
Does that work?
Yes.
Okay. As I said, I worked on the short-term rental ordinance from the county. It probably wouldn't exist if I and my friends had not been working on it. I would recommend everybody look at the Guardian article of January 25th on what this has been doing to cities in Europe. I strongly suggest that you do, in fact, place a limit on nights unhosted because of the impact on neighborhoods. I strongly suggest that you do not allow short-term rentals in any multifamily dwelling, apartment buildings, et cetera, condos, because of the impact on the adjacent residents in those buildings. I suggest no more than 1 short-term rental per parcel. Limited time to grandfather in ADUs that already exist, 2 to 3 years. For people who are relying on short-term rental income to pay their mortgages, taxes, etc., I suggest they go to long-term rentals instead, because we have a severe shortage of housing in this area, both full units and 4 rooms. And we are definitely losing housing. We've lost housing in the Mid-Coast, we've lost housing in Half Moon Bay. I suggest that on initial application you require full code compliance other than fire sprinklers if they don't already exist in the building. That includes smoke detectors, carbon monoxide, clearly identified exits, safe exits, fire extinguishers, etc. And Oh, in answer to the Coastal Commission question you had, the Coastal Commission is not requiring CDPs per unit. They're requiring LCP amendments, and I hadn't seen the word CDP associated with that, but definitely any short-term rental ordinance in the coastside zone requires an LCP amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. The next comment will be Maria Portello. I'm so sorry. I was thinking
Okay.
of mushrooms.
My writing is really
It's not you.
It's really bad. No, my writing's terrible.
Welcome.
I try and type. Hello. My name is Maria Portello Swagel. I've lived on the coast about 20 years, and I'm a teacher here in town for about the last 20 years. I have 3 boys who have been raised on the coast side. I grew up in Southeast Alaska, in Sitka, and I always wondered if I could find a place with the community character of Sitka, but that was on the road to a major city, because it was on an island, and I wanted to be on the road to a major city, and I kind of think I found it. I mean, I think I found this magic place that reminds me and has that community character. San Francisco's right there, as well as many other places. So I'm very happy here. I intend to stay. Let's see, I took notes. We are renting out half of our 2,000 square foot house. So we're renting out the bottom floor of our house. So I am in a hosted situation. So I think that may not be such a debate, but that's what I wanted to talk to, because that's where I'm coming from. I don't have a lot of thoughts or exploration on the unhosted piece, which I think may be the bigger discussion here. So we rent the bottom half, and this model is making it affordable for us to live here. We really cater to families. We with our 3 boys have a really hard time when we're traveling finding a practical place to stay. Somebody invariably needs to nap. 5 people don't fit very well in a 4-person hotel room. We usually can't afford 2 hotel rooms. So we thought, hey, what do we need when we travel? And we've sort of designed our Airbnb to be as such. So we really, really cater to families. In our description, meet lots of really, really interesting families. So I kind of feel like an ambassador a bit of the coast when people come, and I get to tell them all about all the wonderful places. I get to send them to the places that I support as a community member, and that I want them to go to support our community. So I really do feel that ambassador pull towards that. In showing folks all the amazing things the coast has to offer. It's been a really fabulous experience, this whole thing, and I don't think we could afford to live here otherwise, which would be a loss to the, obviously for me to not be able to be a part of this community that I feel so strongly about, and a loss for the community not to get to have my family and I as an integral piece too. The big things I hear are the hosted, unhosted, so mine is hosted. And as I've thought about it over time, the idea of, hey, am I taking a rental place off the market? Before we had kids, we did rent full-time. We rented the place out, and then we rented to my sister. But then as we started to arrive, all 5 of us in our top half of our house, we need to be able to access the bottom half of our house sometimes. We need to hold a party, or we have family that needs to stay right now due to a medical issue, so we need to be able to have that flexibility and can't rent full-time. So anyhow, that's where I'm at. Thank you.
Thank you. I volunteer to be the Sitka ambassador in the Sister City program. The next speaker will. The next speaker would be Chris Voinard. My French is getting challenged, so I apologize if I got that wrong. Followed by Margarita Vasquez, the last green card that I have tonight. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. I just want to say I agree with Tim and with what everything he said. I think instead of focusing on hosted versus non-hosted rentals, the regulation should be focusing on primary or sole residence versus a dedicated STR. Hosted and unhosted are not clearly defined and would be impossible to enforce. The definition of host says that the host has to be on the property. Does that mean at all times? Do the hosts have to physically babysit the guests? Can they leave the property and for how long? How about overnight? Because in my case, I live in my house, and if I Airbnb, I leave the premises and let them move into my house with all my things. The survey said occasionally residents want to infrequently use their property as an STR when they're away on vacation. What does occasionally and infrequently mean? What if a person goes away many weekends to take care of their sick father? Should they not be allowed to have guests during that time? Primary and sole residence, rather than a house built specifically for STR, should be the differentiation. If a person is renting out their own home, they're not going to allow too many people inside. Renting the home in no way adds to the shortage of rental housing, and trash and noise would not be tolerated because homeowners who live in their houses already care about them. And a lot of the other things that are mentioned about that is the same thing about the codes. Of course, our houses were already built to code. I don't think that we need to have our private homes inspected for, we already have fire, CO2. As far as the 30 and 60-day limit, I don't understand what the purpose is of limiting and why are those numbers? They seem arbitrary, 30 or 60 days. How would it be enforced and why? Also, the city would lose out on the tot tax that they are now getting from those. I feel like, we're not Malibu or New Orleans. I'm not sure why we have to have all these added regulations, control, paperwork, bureaucracy, and costs. If it's to pave the way and justify more hotels, the commission and city should consider the citizens over big business. And lastly, about how you identify the STRs, I've already talked to the city council about this, and I'm in litigation about the way HDL has performed skip traces and used their proprietary software in order to find who was Airbnb-ing their house, which I consider this company is writing policy for profit. And it's a whole other subject to get into, but if not for them, a lot of these people would have gone unnoticed under the radar because they are not impacting the neighborhood. The complaints are minimal, and no one would even have known that we were in there. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Ms. Woodard. And Margarita Vasquez, the last green card I have on this item tonight. Welcome.
Good evening. My name is Margarita Vasquez, and I am also a Half Moon Bay resident. And today I come here to talk about the importance of regulating and possibly limiting short-term rentals in Half Moon Bay. First, I believe that having too many short-term rentals may not only decrease our available housing in Half Moon Bay, but also artificially inflate rent costs due to the reality of supply and demand. Two, short-term rentals on a short-term rental host is important because to live in the community it is important for hosts to live in the community in order to ensure that the money goes back to the economy. And three, I think it is important to also acknowledge that if we have short-term rentals in duplex, triplex, and mobile homes, this will also be limited to the community and not allowing for families to live in these. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Vasquez. Is there anyone else in the audience tonight who'd like to speak? Okay, lots of hands. This is the first hand I saw. Ladies first. If you could, please, when you finish speaking, just grab a green card from the back and help us if you would. Oh, very good. Welcome.
Hello, I'm Susan Swear. I live at 206 Washington. And just a little context in terms of where I'm coming from for the short-term rental policy. I've lived in Half Moon Bay 20 years. I'm in a beach community. I've been a landlord myself with long-term tenants. I now live across the street from a property that is investor-owned by somebody outside of Half Moon Bay. It's been an Airbnb, but because they turned their ADU into Airbnb also, that's in the process of being reconciled. So I have seen firsthand the trash that has been scattered as tenants have left. I've seen the disruption of cars. I've seen other Airbnb rentals in the community in the immediate neighborhood where they've had loud parties, and it's been quite disruptive. So I fully support hosted rentals, but I've also seen the disruption that unhosted rentals can have. I also did a survey of what the Airbnb guidelines and short-term rental guidelines are in a number of cities. Probably I looked at 8 to 10 cities that are very tourist-oriented, some of which were coastal cities, and I think there are a few points that I would like to see considered. Several cities actually develop policy objectives specifically for their short-term rentals. So one of those is generally to protect quality of life in residential neighborhoods, and I see that in places like Manhattan Beach and Palm Desert. And there's also often an explicit objective to limit short-term rental uses while preventing the loss of housing stock. And so I would like us, as we're thinking about our policies for short-term rentals, to be very explicit about what we're trying to accomplish. I wholly support folks needing extra income, and I don't want to see that inhibited in any way, but I do want to see owners take responsibility for their property. I'm not so crazy about having investors who are outside of the area have no restrictions on them. So I don't know how we address that, but I would like to see that. I do see that, generally speaking, I think in contrast to what Scott said, I do often see for the kinds of cities that I think are comparable to Half Moon Bay that there are limits for unhosted rentals, and so I'm an advocate of doing that. And other than that, I think most of the guidelines that we've that have been discussed, I think have already been covered.
Thank you, Ms. Square. If you could give the green sheet to Joe. Thank you. I saw other hands. That gentleman, thank you. And then this gentleman, and then that young lady. Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Scott Frazier. I moved here when I was 6, going to be 48, so it makes me a 42-year resident here of the coast. I've seen the place change quite a bit from when I grew up in Sea Haven to where I now live in West Miramar. I'm an attorney here on the coast. I have my office on Main Street, lifelong citizen, plan to stay that way. I have drafted the short-term rental ordinance for Lake Tulloch. I've been involved in several other counties and areas where there have been short-term rental businesses and ordinances and participated in the drafting. If there's a place that does not need an ordinance, it's Half Moon Bay. At less than 0.5% of the rental of the properties going to short-term rentals, it doesn't seem like it's any kind of a problem. Enforcing existing noise laws, density laws, trash and disruption laws will probably easily save the neighbors from much of the hassle. And you can always get on a neighbor's case if they're not being a responsible renter. Where I live by the beach, I see more trash come from the visitors that come during the summer days and leave their garbage, their diapers, etc., right there on the side of my house. If these things were enforced, we wouldn't see them. That's neither here nor there. The things that I do want to talk about are the business of short-term rentals. What a lot of people don't realize is that the owners of the short-term rentals are generally doing them for necessity, and they are not even usually making as much as they would with a full-time renter. It is for the flexibility. By the time you ping out the extra utilities you're paying, most of us are now at peak demand pricing, so we're running the dryer and the washing machine more and the extra lights, etc. You're not coming out as far ahead as a lot of people think. If you're gonna do something on this and you're looking at parking issues, I highly suggest you stay away from on-site parking. If we're going to encourage people to have EVs and plug-in hybrids, then you're going to want to have all the space on the house available for the full-time residents who do live there if you're going to do hosted so that they can plug in their cars. Reducing one of the spots for the residents isn't going to help anything, and it's just going to cause that resident to push their car back off on the street. So it's not going to solve anything. Finally, one of the advantages to doing short-term rentals, in addition to the flexibility, is the fact that you don't have to fool around with some of the tenants' rights that can be acquired for people who stay more than 30 days and end up being just as bad of a tenant to the neighborhood and just as bad of a tenant to the homeowner. So I guess my closing, I want to reiterate, I don't think we need this here at this time, and I hope we stay away from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Frazier. Another speaker, sir. Welcome.
Thank you for your time and concern for the issue and the opportunity to lend my voice on an ad hoc basis. My name is Brian Wilson. I've never sung with the Beach Boys. I'm a 15-year one 5-year resident of the beautiful Alsace-Lorraine neighborhood, live in the heart on Correas, where we have several Airbnbs. And I want to make crystal clear that my concern, and several of my neighbors who I speak informally for, we have no issue with Airbnb. We don't want more rules and regs. But something needs to be done about the unhosted, absentee investor owner. I lost a wonderful neighbor, and it was replaced with a 14-bed Airbnb. You can find it instantly by Googling vacation rental Half Moon Bay and zeroing in on 14 beds. It's absurd. He filled each bedroom with bunk beds. It's not my idea of a good time, but you know, the possibility is there. We've seen kegs come in, and it's frightening to my wife. Frankly, the issue isn't parking. Yeah, they block my walk. I have one of the few walks that extends to the street. They block my mailbox. I look the other way. My concern is the trash. Nearly every week, either the wind, the wildlife, and I'm talking the big black scary ravens, or yesterday a stray dog dining in the dumpster, so to speak, except there's no dumpster. It's just the standard 2 bins for compost and recycling and garbage. So the tenants who come in, they don't care about the appearance of the street and the neighborhood like the residents do. They routinely leave overflowing trash, and the owner-investor resides in Palo Alto. I've called him. He does not come running. In one case, there was no response for a full week until Republic came through again. Meanwhile, the trash is defiling the neighborhood all over my lawn, and of greater concern to my wife and I, blowing down Correas towards the ocean. So, I don't know if Tim Pon's still here. I want to be real clear. We're all for hosted scenarios with caring, attentive owners. It's the unhosted, hate to keep using the example, remote investor in Palo Alto that is at issue. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And yes, sir. Wilson. I'm sorry, Mr. Wilson. Not a big Beach Boy fan. Should be.
Good evening, I'm David Jerome, and I am one of the unhosted Airbnb owners.
Excuse me, Mr. Jordan, if you could move just a little bit closer to the mic.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
I just recently purchased this house. I expect it to be a retirement house for myself and my wife. I'm hoping to move down here in a year or two. But in the meantime, we are spending as much time as we can, and when we're not living in the house, we are renting it. And it seems to be working out well for us. It's working out well for our neighbors. Our neighbors are very happy with us at the moment because we're cleaning the place up. We also are in the Alsace-Lorraine neighborhood, and I can assure you that all of our tenants are very well behaved and clean up their trash because we care very much for our house. We also have another house on the property which is being rented as a full-time rental. That's a 500 square foot cottage, and when we move down here full-time, we expect that we're going to be renting that part-time so that we could have our children come and visit us. So I am all in favor of regulations, all in favor of keeping places in good order, in having the owners responsible, and having local management. But restricting the amount of days that I could rent my place, I'd really object to. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jerome. Was there anyone else who wanted to speak on this item tonight? Yes, sir. Mr. Drum, if you could fill out one of those green cards, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
My name's Jim Sutro. I
Welcome.
live downtown. Much to be said, but the only thing I'm going to speak to is the idea of responsibility. We're calling it hosted versus unhosted. I like the concept of having an individual that is responsible, will be responsive to the neighbors, to the police, to anybody's got a problem with what's going on, they got to turn to and deal with it. The idea is somebody's not going to respond for a week, that ain't going to happen at my unit. My daughter lives in El Granada. She'll be right on top of it. I've got 2 or 3 general contractors, handyman, repairman. If I'm not available, and that's the only time I rent my house is when I go away on vacation, somebody's going to respond. Somebody will be there, and I don't want any, and it's my home. I vet the people that stay there very, very carefully because I don't want things missing. I want to know exactly who's in my house. It's responsibility. That's all I care about.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Matthew Buryeshi.
Welcome.
I love the last speaker's discussion of responsibility. I also like flexibility. I don't participate in hosting or unhosting of a house, but at some point, if I want to travel, or heaven forbid, I have to go stay with a relative somewhere, I really like the idea of having the flexibility to have it be my house, but also to pay my very high taxes, even if it's 8 months. And in that vein of responsibility, it seems like there may be some opportunities to think about for the things that make people bad neighbors. I believe that there are codes against a lot of those right now. If we're looking for a regulation, maybe the regulation in and of itself could be that the fines get considerably more expensive if something is registered as a short-term rental. If you live there, not a problem because you're going to make sure you're code compliant. If you're a responsible person who is doing an unhosted, that's great. If you're somebody who's thinking about it for the money, which I would think that the 14-bed owner in Palo Alto is, if they were staring down the barrel at like $25K a month in fines for filthy garbage, for their 7th fine in a year, whatever that is, that's a really good way to use economics with a reasonably light touch to get to, I think, what I've heard from a lot of people tonight, which is responsibility.
Thank you very much. Are there any other speakers that want to address us tonight? Going, gone. So we'll close the public hearing, and I'd like to bring it back to my colleagues to distill the wisdom we heard, for which we thank you all very much. Brian?
I'll go for it. And thank you, everybody, for coming out and speaking. Lots of good points on both sides of the issue, and I think I think it's one of the things that's important to keep in context here is sort of why we're considering this. I think there's a number of different things. One's, just neighborhood compatibility, the character of our town. I think concerns about disruption, those types of things. Those are all legitimate concerns. And I think the housing issue is also a very legitimate concern. And I think that's there's 2 sides to that coin. One, there's the ability of people to be able to generate revenue, to be able to stay in their homes. But then there's also the concern about taking housing out of stock. I think this is just sort of one thing that we're talking about in relation to housing in Half Moon Bay. So I just want to highlight that there's been a lot of conversations about whether it's accessory dwelling units or where we can provide more affordable housing opportunities. And I've said a number of times that my primary concern is not so much the short-term rentals and those who are trying to make it, it's the sort of absentee homeowners who buy a home and maybe only come over and stay for 30 days or a year or something like that, and then their house sits dark all the rest of the time. So I know there's a handful of houses in my neighborhood and along the coast that seem to just be generally unoccupied and not available for short-term rental or long-term rental, and it's and we've actually had a couple applicants that have come before us for different houses and basically stated that they want to build large houses to be able to come and visit on a weekend every now and then. Otherwise, the house sits empty. that's taken away housing from people who could live here. And it's taken away opportunity for potentially affordable short-term rentals. So I think that's a problem that we need to consider. Not necessarily as part of this, but just putting that out there. I really like the comments about responsibility and flexibility. In my perfect world, you know, we all just work this out with our neighbors. We make sure we're not impeding on each other. We're trying to make sure that there's enough housing for everybody else, and we all get along. I know it's not necessarily a perfect world, but I think to the extent that we can try to make sure we're building in the, you know, the measures of responsibility and flexibility into whatever code that we have, that, and we don't have to have this heavy-handed code enforcement sort of situation to where anybody who happens to have an issue with their neighbor is suddenly calling up Scott or Jill constantly to get enforcement about every little detail, and if they're in compliance, I think is critical. I think, you know, staff's done a good job of trying to put these into clear buckets, hosted, unhosted, but I don't think there's a lot of different situations and variations that can happen on the coast, and I can think of, you know, yeah, just a number of situations that might not fit perfectly within the code that I think we'll need to think about how we address those. One of them being raised by, I think, Ms. Portello, who mentioned that she used to rent her bottom floor full time, which would lead me to assume that there's full kitchen facilities and that type of thing. My reading of what's here is that that wouldn't be a hosted rental. That would be a separate ADU. I don't know if that's correct or not, but, and that would be, I think your situations, that situation is something that, you know, I would be supportive of that continuing. It's within a house and that sort of thing, but falls within maybe a different category. So something to consider there. I fully agree with a lot of the concerns about the investor acquired properties and unhosted Airbnb owners. I'm more comfortable with, you know, if a host is within proximity to their rental, maybe they're not exactly right on the property, but if they happen to live around the corner or somewhere else in town, that I think there was sort of a 20-minute response time listed in there. I think that's worth considering and something to put in there. But I thought the comments from Margarita, I think, were really, I would be interested in seeing if there's research out there or other data about how short-term rentals potentially impact rental rates in the city, and if it does artificially inflate rental costs, and if that's something that impacts our existing rental stock, I think would be of concern. So I guess, I share the concerns that, we don't want to generate a solution and look for a problem. I don't want us to necessarily be responding to, a few squeaky wheels or, and if we're sort of jumping on the concerns that these short-term rentals have been a problem in places like Tahoe and other places where you virtually have no existing residents that are there. And it's possible and it's feasible to think that that situation would happen in Half Moon Bay, where, a beautiful community that people like, but right now that situation doesn't necessarily seem to be here. So I think having something there, but ensuring that we have some responsibility and flexibility, and making sure that we're avoiding any unintended consequences is a good approach to go. And with that, I'll cut off my comments for now and listen to my others.
Yeah, reload. Commissioner Polgar, you still collecting or?
Go ahead. I very much appreciate Commissioner Holt's comments. That was very eloquently put, and I would echo a lot of that. And I think that one of the things that in reading all the information and then hearing the comments tonight, and thank you all, it really helps me understand the scope of the issues in front of us, is I'm still confused about the kind of concept of how defining like unhosted and hosted. There was a comment brought up about how whether maybe it's more the question of the primary and sole residence versus dedicated for a short-term rental. I think that's a different kind of way of thinking about it. But also I see the value of being able to have a short-term rental where you're not necessarily immediately on the property, but you are nearby, like you are a block away or something. If there are, I mean, I do think that is a flexibility that would be nice to include. So that to me is a very difficult, even in looking through the table of examples that had been pulled together, I guess, by the Coastal Commission of it was as if unhosted and hosted was clear to everybody. And I didn't feel that way. And then I also think I don't quite understand how it gels with the ADU. Because it seems to me, for instance, where if somebody is going to be able to like move into an ADU, then are they, and maybe, I don't know if that's attached or not attached, and then how does that bear on renting their house, the primary residence, as a short-term rental versus a long-term rental? I think there's a lot of, it gets to me very confusing. I am very much in favor of having, for sure, what I think we're calling the hosted rental, in the sense that of having that responsible, not absentee short-term rental, and because of the flexibility it offers residents and to be able to afford to live here. But also, I'm always talking about having affordable visitor serving accommodations on the coast. I'm the coastal access person. I love that, and so I do think that having short-term rentals is very important as another way of providing, especially families, but others who just can't afford to stay in a hotel, that it can, and especially when if it's kind of what we're calling this hosted, where there's a presence there and stuff, I think, that will offer that option. I also think that those tend to be lower cost when you look at Airbnb listings. So as opposed to somebody who's renting like a 14-bed party house. So that I'm very strongly do not want to see this regulate that to the point that it makes it hard for residents to do that. I think that's really important. I would be interested, would like to second Brian's comment about being interested to see if there's information about the impacts of short-term rentals on long-term rental rates. I don't know if that is something that has been seen in other places, but, and then there was I think it was the last comment was about thinking about mechanisms for making sure that the really bad actors, that absentee kind of party house where there's no responsibility, thinking about ways to address that. So essentially, let's target the problem as opposed to the average, like the outliers. I do think that's not necessarily easy. Enforcement is always the tricky part. But I will say that may be easier than trying to say, we're going to enforce 90 days a year. I mean, I'm not exactly sure how the city would enforce a day limit. I'm not saying I want to explore it more, but I'm just saying I just don't know that that's the best mechanism for achieving this kind of, let's address these problems kind of at the tail as well. So, yes, I think that's all I have for now.
Thank you. Steve?
Thanks. Thanks. Excuse me. Thank you to everybody who came out tonight. It's obviously a lively topic. The survey, I think, with approaching 200 respondents to the survey, which, as Joe pointed out, a third of them were in favor of short-term rentals, a third violently opposed, and another third okay as long as there are right limits. So it makes it a lively debate. Whenever I think about Airbnb these days, I'm reminded of this thing I read about a year ago online, and maybe you all have heard this, but the guy said, if you doubt the power of the internet in today's world, the world's largest transportation company, Uber, has no vehicles. The world's largest retailer, eBay, has no stores, and the world's largest provider of lodging, Airbnb, has no facilities of its own. So I think that's here to stay. I think that I'm in strong agreement with Commissioners Polgar and Holt that you know, I'm very sympathetic to folks who've had bad experiences with folks in the short-term rentals, especially, it seems, the unhosted ones. I live in a neighborhood where litter and noise pollution are sometimes a problem, especially in the summer after hours, and it has, I'm pretty certain, nothing to do with people staying in short-term rentals, but just other forms of young people visiting the beaches. So as I manage my own response to what you all have said and what I've read in the survey, I try to not get to overreact to the anecdotes about those bad experiences. I think it seems clear to me that a small number of those so-called bad actors can influence people's perception of how it's working. Certainly we've read and heard good things about what hosted short-term rentals bring to the residents of the city, some of whom probably couldn't afford to be coastal residents without that. They bring in revenue to the city, and as Sarah said, they provide a very real mechanism for some people to visit the coast who otherwise could not. I guess my concern going forward is I'd like us to think clearly about the so-called unhosted or rentals without clear responsible parties, to think carefully about that and think what could be done to manage that. I think that I think Matt made the comment at the very end. Something that I've been thinking about myself is that if there are repeat offenders in this space, I think it is appropriate to bring a pretty heavy hammer down on those folks. I suppose it's legally not possible to fine Airbnb itself in a case like this, but I think we should think about depriving the folks who abuse this, the folks, if it comes to pass there are rentals where there isn't a responsible party when bad incidents take place. I think that the fine should be severe. I think that people should lose the business license and the right to host those things if there's abuse of that. And this way we can focus on the true problems and not cast a blanket of negativity around every host. I think that I'm okay with the concept of short-term rentals everywhere that there's residential zoning. The staff had asked for feedback on whether we wanted maybe some special emphasis on allowing non-hosted in the CD and CR zoning. I don't have a problem with that. I don't know whether it's worth the trouble of doing it today. I don't know whether the return on investment of the hours needed to codify that would be there. You could argue that might be a little more important in the future as downtown evolves. I wouldn't be opposed to that. I'll catch my breath at this point and pass the...
Okay, thank you. Have you reloaded, Brian?
Sure, just a couple other thoughts. I think, actually, I was sort of struck by, I read an article recently, which I don't necessarily entirely agree with in total, but it was sort of a provocative headline that, we don't necessarily have a housing crisis, but we have a sharing crisis. And it was really kind of going into the fact that we're at this point now with baby boomers getting older and Prop 13, where we have a lot of people occupying much larger houses, but with much smaller households. And I know I've seen that in a number of places where either single or just a couple. I can think of my in-laws actually, who live right near transit in downtown Redwood City and occupying a pretty large single-family home and much of it sits empty all the time, and they're not watching tonight, but it irks the hell out of me. So I think, and then I'm struck with a conversation I had with another woman who lived downtown during some of the affordable housing workshops, where she was an older woman, occupied a large house by herself, and really said, she'd like to have more flexibility to do something. She can't necessarily leave and buy a smaller house somewhere else because suddenly her taxes are going to go up. So she's really locked into staying in her home. But she said, hey, I get lonely. I wouldn't mind, being able to rent out a portion of it or something like that. So I think, those opportunities are good, and we should be encouraging some of that sharing and really making the best use of our existing housing stock and our existing developed footprint as much as we can. And then I just want to touch on, the other boogeyman in Half Moon Bay, which is often parking. I actually live on a street that I think in our neighborhood and also in Arleta Park is probably the most heavily parked street, and it's fine. I don't think I think parking. It's one of those things that really irks some people if they have to walk, an extra little bit to get to their house or something like that. But by and large, as I go through Alsace Lorraine and in other places, I don't think there's a whole lot of parking. If Tim was here, I'd say, maybe you should get his fire truck off the road. But that's a whole separate conversation. Other than that, I think one of the things that did come up was the inclusion of mobile home parks and some of those. And I think, looking at those areas that really provide a really unique affordable housing option, I think we should specifically look at those areas as not allowing for short-term rentals in those areas that are really, like I say, whether it's the mobile home parks. I know I noticed in some of the other cities' ordinances that specifically exempted farm worker housing, some of those other types of things. I think we really need to continue to try to encourage those types of uses to be available for the people who need it. So that's all I got there.
Okay. I'll jump on the carousel after the next round. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I forgot to give you some input on the kind of types of residential uses, and I would agree with the recommendation that it not be something that's appropriate for the duplex, triplex, and or triplex, sorry, and multifamily. And I think that if I'm understanding it correctly, so I think that that's probably one thing that I wouldn't want to see is that housing that is definitely would want to see any kind of housing that would be more affordable being then put into short-term rental. So that would be very important to avoid. I also, I don't know about in terms of the parking. I understood the kind of rationale of thinking about, because we have such a limit, having gone through this ADU process and know that based on the state law, we just have no say. We cannot require parking, and when you have a number of additional units that could be added and with no additional parking, I'm not sure that I would agree necessarily that parking won't be an issue. Maybe right now it isn't, but I do think that there comes a point where with the number of ADUs that could be added in neighborhoods, that it won't just be a matter of like walking a block. It could be that you just can't find parking, and that I also don't want to see our neighborhoods just become completely parking lots. I think that's just does not support the community neighborhood character. So that one I would want to think long and hard about that, because I think it's also is reasonable in many cases. to expect that a parking space could be provided, especially if somebody's going to be, the owner's not going to be there, then likely often there could be a parking space available on site. But that's one where I'm still kind of not sure that I would just be okay with saying, oh yeah, no parking requirement or anything like that.
Thank you. Steve, you ready to have another go?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Polgar on the parking thing. I think the day when EV charging is widespread enough that becomes an issue, I think will be a great day. I think in the meantime, it makes sense for us to think about requiring hosts to provide at least one space off the street. Excuse me. I wanted to also support what Commissioner Holt said not long ago. I have noticed that the question of short-term rentals is actually a subset of a bigger issue in Half Moon Bay, which is that of empty houses in general. I know of at least 3 houses in Arleta Park neighborhood, not far from me, that stand empty. The first one was used as an Airbnb property for about 6 months, and never again. That was probably 2 years ago. And the 2 others, I've never seen a person in there, even though they're like new. I guess it's a case of the homeowners have the financial flexibility to live somewhere else and keep those houses for a rainy day or retirement on the coast. It's a shame when, it's the American way in a lot of ways, I guess, but it's a shame when you think about that impact on our housing stock. I don't have a proposal for how to deal with that, but it might be an interesting thing for the city to explore at some point, the empty housing issue. In general, on short-term rentals, I'm a fan of having faith in the free market in general working, that the right number of those things will match up with what the demand is in Half Moon Bay with a little bit of flexibility. We heard that our best ability to count them today, we might be looking at a small percent, 2 or 3% maybe at most of total housing. So to me, that means that we don't need to invest in an awful lot of legislation above and beyond what we have today. I think that our residents absolutely deserve to have the character of the neighborhood preserved, but we have if we can figure out how to enforce our noise and parking and garbage code that exists today, if we can enforce that, then we'll be going most of the way to preserving that neighborhood flavor. And I realize that's easier said than done, but I know we'll look at what the enforcement of the code will require. I also think going forward it would be great to invest a little bit more in our ability to count and report on the numbers and the issues. And I would reserve the right to maybe change my mind on the impact of the unhosted rentals if for some reason this became a problem that was getting worse beyond the scope of it today.
Okay, my turn. So thank you for the comments. Again, thank you to the public for what you guys had said. I have some reflections on the ordinance as well. And while I agree in many respects with all of my colleagues, whereas Steve was talking about the free market, I am less of a libertarian perhaps. And I am concerned that we will, if we allow the free market to operate, we will have careful preservation of the community character until we don't anymore. That is the tragedy of the commons argument in libertarian parlance. And so I do believe that regulation for the volume of short-term rentals is actually important. And I don't pretend to know what the number is. What I think we need is a big stick that we can use so that we have not opened the door to lose the ability to manage it. the way we have lost the ability to manage ADUs through no fault of our own, I think. And so, so this does concern me. In terms of impacts, I can speak from personal experience to some, just as an anecdote to try to spice up your thinking about this a little bit. One of my neighbors has a short-term rental. It was unhosted. They moved to a less expensive place in El Granada. And the people who rent are very nice. But in the morning, I come out and I find raccoons eating from the garbage. And, you know, I knock on the door and say, you know, you need to pick that up. If I were a more timid neighbor, that would never happen. And you know, of course, the owner of the property was mortified and anxious to take steps. Others had parties. I think we're all aware of the potential catastrophes, not that they're the every case, but I believe it was, in Orinda in the East Bay where that nightmare scenario happened. So I'm interested in the public safety angle, and I don't know what lessons we can learn and apply from the Orinda nightmare, but I'm conscious, and I think as a matter of public safety, all of us should be conscious of those potential hazards. The staff report did a nice job of introducing in some of the examples the notion of a good neighbor policy, the idea that we lay out in our program for short-term rentals a policy that would lay out expectations not just in a cold, regulated way, in addition to the regulations that constitute the big stick that we hope we never have to take out. You'd have a good neighbor policy that communicates to the owner of the rental, that they communicate to the potential client, that they communicate to the neighbors, that say, this is how we expect it to operate. And of course, I know that the Airbnb program has its own version of that. But Half Moon Bay could tailor it because we know where our problems are. We know where the raccoons come up and eat trash. We know where an Airbnb, or sorry, a short-term rental might be adjacent to sensitive habitat. And a visitor might not know about that. They might not be aware of the rules for how we separate garbage and recycling. How frequently do you see a recycling can that has become an auxiliary garbage can? And you know, if there were a problem, does the neighbor know who to call? How do we make it safe and easy for that neighbor to do that? So I think that in terms of our policy, this good neighbor policy is the ounce of prevention, but that doesn't mean that we don't still need a pound of cure, in my opinion. After hearing the deputy city attorney talk about the CDP issue, of course the bell went off, and you know, we have coastal development permits for citywide programs. We did it for drainage, so it is not an either-or proposition. The amendments could be reflected in some combination of those things, and I'll be interested in how it is that it gets laid out. Of course, if it's in the zoning ordinance in part, that's clearly an LCP update, but perhaps there's another angle as well. I appreciated all of the comments. Many of them were addressed by my colleagues. I just want to speak to Mr. Olson's comment, because there is a principle in planning for new and unexpected things that it makes a lot of sense to look at people who have gone there first and ask what happened with them. So if he is advocating that there are experiences in other places and that we should climb that experience curve. I realize that California is its own unique place, and I think this represents our efforts to think about this in terms of California. My understanding from Mr. Olson's comments and my own experience living in Grenoble, France for some years, is that those places have dealt with this tourism problem and the demand for housing over a longer period of time, in some cases a much longer period of time. And they have had a chance to try different solutions and run into brick walls. And it does make sense to kind of, you know, look at the article that Mr. Olson mentions. I'm not advocating that we go out and, you know, hire a researcher to think about this. But, where we can get information that's low-hanging fruit to help us learn, I think that makes quite a bit of sense. With respect to ADUs, I'm fully in support of protecting them from being converted to short-term rentals. With respect to multifamily residential, mobile home parks, I am also believe that they should not become short-term rentals. I see those as valuable housing stock. I will tread lightly in the mixed-use zoning because they have residences, and the idea that those residences could suddenly become unhosted represents a change in the intended use in some ways, just as we expect ADUs to behave like ADUs. I want to be sure that we have a clear view of what the intention is and that that's the intention that we get. That area is already experiencing a crisis about retail, and adding more may or may not help. Maybe the demand would be created by visitors in that area that would liven up businesses. I don't know. But I would be hesitant to see it as a substantial period of time in a CDR area. Which brings me to the question of limits on the number of days. To me, that is a defining feature of what makes a neighborhood, is that people live there. And if they're moving in and out, it changes the character of the neighborhood. I've lived in the same house for 23 years now, something like that. And my parents still live in a house. They've been in it for 60 years. So I admit that I'm probably an outlier in today's society. I'm probably not the kind of person that advocates for quick change in these areas, but I believe that some change is good, some change is helpful. Too much change can be disruptive to a neighborhood. Specifically within residential neighborhoods, I support some language that reflects an occupancy limit. I saw several examples in the staff report that talked about the number of homes, the number of residents that could occupy a home that was related to the number of bedrooms. Unless they were having a party for, a phalanx of 3-year-olds, that looks like it could cover a lot of ground. So I'm guessing that would probably be helpful. I think, to summarize, in addition to the thoughtful comments of my colleagues, I think it's important to pick an asset test when you look at a draft idea about how we're going to regulate this, and then you look at a situation that could occur, right? A plumbing disaster, or we have a power outage, or God forbid, something like what happened in Orinda, or maybe just the annual pumpkin festival, and we ask ourselves whether it's how does the community effectively address the concerns at that one home, or what is the effect of that macro event like the pumpkin festival if everybody in the neighborhood decides this is a great chance to not only collect $10 for parking, but to collect, let's say, 3 digits for a couple of days of the weekend? What is the neighborhood like? Does that really capture, have we protected the neighborhood character? Or is any restriction represent a departure from a welcoming town? Personally, I think it's too much. And I think we have to skate toward where the puck will be in that day of more ADUs. We clearly underestimated the enthusiasm of ADUs. So I think it makes sense to be cautious. And that's why, just as we proposed experimentation with the parklet at our last planning commission meeting, I think it makes sense to move forward with an ordinance, but to do it in a way that we don't leave the barn door wide open and find ourselves without tools to manage it later. So I probably advocate a slightly more cautious approach. I don't know if any of my colleagues feel like that's a mistake. If they don't, I'd love to get agreement. I think those are the things that I specifically wanted to comment on. Let me just double check. I don't think that an inspection is an unreasonable regime when we initially license. Obviously, we don't want people wandering around saying, hey, I'm the city, I'm here for my monthly inspection. But, the standards that we uphold for visitors who may not be familiar with the area, who may not know the rules, they're exposed to a greater sense of, there's a greater risk there. And to the extent that our permitting processes could expose the city to liability, I'm not here to prescribe that the homeowner have or not have liability insurance. I'm guessing that a lot of the Airbnb organizations impose that. But I do think it's important for the city's posterior to be covered. And so regulations that require the city to be held harmless in the event of a problem, I saw in some of the examples that were presented to us, feels like something that we need since we've had experience with being on the wrong end of lawsuits. So, more comments, colleagues. Brian.
I don't have much other than to support your sort of the notion of, one, I like the idea of the good neighbor policy, but the idea that, this is going to evolve and change over time, and having a way to be responsive to those changes, whether it's, I don't know if it's an annual review or having data or, doing those types of things to where we can, if we have to put the screws down a little bit harder or we realize that this isn't as big of a deal as we're all concerned about, just that we have that flexibility, and I support that notion.
Anybody else?
I would, echo Commissioner Holt's comments as well about, I think that you raised some really good points about the ability to refine over time as we see what happens. And I really do like the concept of the good neighbor policy. And I do think that the limit on number of guests, I didn't mention that, but I kind of was under the assumption that that would be something that would be looked at and considered, because I think that's a very important aspect as well. And I would also want to explore as I said before, really what we mean by hosted and unhosted. I think that there needs to be a little bit more clarity on that, and so that we can allow for flexibility. So that's just kind of throwing that out there again. And there was one other thing that, and I would also like to echo the concerns about the empty houses. I've never actually, I've heard it and I always nod, but I'm going to put it on the record that very much concerns me. I happen to know that right around me, I have that issue as well. So, yeah.
Steve?
You're to the chair, your idea on the good neighbor policy, I think, makes a lot of sense. There are specific and unique and special aspects to so many locations in Half Moon Bay where it would be wonderful to have that written up for the owners, for the guests and the neighbors. I also was okay with the limits on the number of guests. It seems to be pretty universal in other jurisdictions, so no quarrel with that. I just, one question to Chair Benjamin. I'm a little fuzzy on whether you're advocating us to go forward with flexibility to impose caps on numbers, or you'd like to see us adopt that this year, sometime soon.
I may have given you the impression that my thinking is more evolved than it is. I feel like a cap is appropriate. I feel like at some point bringing, I would like to resolve the barracks rental. That doesn't strike me as that doesn't feel like a neighborhood to me. I know there's a place for it, and it's probably low-cost housing, but I can see adverse consequences. But not independently of that, I think it makes sense for staff to have a chance to chew on it. And obviously we're not making any decisions tonight. If they can bring back a proposal that does have those limits, I'm certainly open to hearing them. But I want them to know that we're thinking it's a good idea, if we do. Sarah?
Are we talking limits on total number of short-term rentals? Or are you talking, sorry.
So I interpreted Steve's question to be with respect to occupancy limits. Maybe I misunderstood.
In your remarks a few minutes ago, I thought you were going towards wanting a cap on the number of short-term rentals in the city, or a cap on the number of unhosted rentals in the city.
Yeah, I don't know the answer yet. My gut feeling is that there is some number that is too many. And I understand that that seems impossible today. You look around and say, how could there be that many in the future? But we could say that about ADUs. We could be surprised by the number of ADUs. There was adequate examples in the Coastal Commission approved short-term rental policies that laid out some grounds for changes in community character, infrastructure, saturation. I forget what the others are, but we certainly have roadway issues, we have sewage issues, and I think there are reasonable neighborhood character issues. But I don't pretend to know what those numbers are, and I think that having a framework for thinking about them so that we can adapt is the most important thing. Once we have that, then we can decide, I guess I would put it this way. I would hope that staff could help us adopt a futurist perspective about how many short-term rentals there should be. So before we get to where we've damaged community character, what are the signposts that tell us we're on that road to damaging community character? That's the trigger that should tell me we need to have a limit. But I don't know what that is. That's my thinking about this at the moment. But it's as evolved as it sounds, which is not very far. Sarah? Oh, Steve.
Well, it's all interesting. I had the impression that staff is looking to the commission for some guidance on what we want those things to do. So maybe we both have to show some leadership. If I could ask of staff a question about the Coastal Commission limits. I was struck by the fact that it's very common, it seems, to have caps on the numbers of short-term rentals per permittee and per parcel, but very rare to find one for the city in general. I think I found Pismo Beach and one other thing that had that. Is it appropriate to ask you folks what your perspective is on that?
If you want to know, it sure is.
All right, through the chair, we looked at also Pacific Grove, I believe, tangled with trying to put a cap on the number of short-term rentals. It's a hard one to enforce, and I like the question about what would be indicators for when you might need to consider it. We think it would be probably, despite looking futuristically, and that's what we are trying to do with some of this, I don't think you need it, especially in considering the community comment that we heard, at least at this time. But the empty house notion, the reality of that, it is something that we've heard from your city council about as well. I don't know how to get an inventory of that, but I think it has a relationship. So we need to do some more thinking on that. Your council has even asked us to think about empty house taxes. Vancouver, BC has one of those. We're not up to that game right now, but we know that you're bringing it up pretty strongly tonight, so we appreciate that. I do have a summary of what we think your direction mostly is, and where we're not quite sure. When you're done, though, we don't want to interrupt you.
You guys want to hold forth some more, or you want the summary to date? What do you got?
Okay, we've got some clarity on zoning districts. Yes, single-family zones appropriate. Absolutely not in the mobile home park zones. We have seen bans in other cities for mobile home parks zones and unit type, and we understand why, and we respect your direction on that. We think it's a good choice. Multifamily residential, duplex, triplex, we heard, I think mostly no, although I'm not sure about hosted, like if somebody had a room there. So think about that. That's one way to help people afford their unit. And then mixed use is sort of interesting because really the type of housing units, they vary a lot in the mixed use zones. They could be single family homes, they could be duplexes, triplexes, multifamily, or units with commercial. So maybe we should think less about the zoning district and more about the unit type is where I think it's a little bit clearer. So then we go to the next page, and that kind of shakes out depending on how you feel about hosted in some of those multifamily types. Then moving on to page 3, hosted, unhosted, we heard very clearly that you need more kind of definition of what these two things are. We heard broad support for hosted just kind of across the board. That's working well for lots of different reasons, and that's great. With unhosted, what we heard from community comment tonight, I think is really important, and we would like to do some more research, and I think it goes along the lines of what some of the commissioners' discussion about flexibility. If primary residence is a requirement, that can be incredibly helpful for that flexibility that you were talking about, where somebody's on call right around the corner. This is where they live for the most part, and maybe they travel a lot, and they want some flexibility to be able to have an unhosted rental when they're traveling. And by the way, I'm sorry that the woman has left, but that survey question about I just want to be clear about why we put that in there. We knew going into this that there were people who are very, very concerned about unhosted short-term rentals, and in fact about all of them. And so we added that question after the, if you don't like unhosted, how do you feel about if you go on vacation and happen to have somebody stay in your house and it happened to be through a short-term rental approach? Well, then people were more comfortable with that. We were just trying to help people visualize it. And so it wasn't a trick question. It was very, we thought it was transparent. I'm sorry if it didn't feel okay to that person. We'll try to find her and talk to her about it. But and the people responded to it. They were more comfortable with that idea. So we just thought it brought some nuance out, and we hope that was helpful. Anyway, that relates to primary residence again, and whether or not we would. We did not hear clear definition or direction about limiting numbers of nights. We agree it is hard to enforce. If we didn't have primary residency, though, we probably would want you to think about a number of night limitation on, because at that point you really don't have a house. Okay. Let's see. Am I getting it? They're going to tell me if I'm wrong. Okay. Page 5. So this is 5 and 6. These lists remind me of how your zoning code already works for home occupations in the single-family residential zoning district. What we were hearing, and we are not trying to make a whole big hard code, and it sounds like we could have a light hand with this. And looking at how home occupations are codified here is very simple, and how they are processed at City Hall is also very simple through a business license process. And of course, this also would require the TOT side of that. But there's ways to have these kinds of performance standards be put into the code in a pretty simple way that's part of the checklist for getting your business approved. So I think we're kind of seeing clear to something that it does not need to be too complex and spending a lot of time trying to code for a few bad actors. It would be a good way, though, to have on the record all of those kinds of nuisance issues that the city's code may already address in different directions, but really have it compiled specifically to this use, and could include the good neighbor policy. Neighbor notification we think is really important, and having a point of contact and those kinds of things. So that's where insurance comes in. That's where occupancy limit of people per room, not numbers of short-term rentals, but people per room. So these things seem to me, for any of the speakers, things that they could accomplish and have their unit work, which is part of the goal. And I'm almost there. We already talked about empty house tax. Counting and reporting, we're talking with our administrative services department just about how that's being done now and what the future could look like for that, and if there's more options for having better data over time, and I'm sure that there are. And that's about it. I don't know if that's enough, and if you have conflicts that you want to talk about a little bit more tonight, or if you want us to come back with some choices.
I appreciate the clarifications and the reminder that maybe we didn't make a clear reference to how we feel about the number of days limitation per year. I heard a sort of a gently framed notion that it becomes extremely sensitive, or relatively more sensitive, if there's an unhosted STR. In the presence of the owner, if they are living in the place, perhaps it takes on the quality of a house guest from the point of view of their neighbors. I don't know. I will say that I think that the home business occupation license is a really nice model, point of departure for thinking about this, because the model for that says basically that your neighbors are happy with you, that you're not impacting them. And if you are impacting them, it makes it an open issue when it's time to renew your license. So, you know, as a framework for thinking about it, I see why they took that. I've had one of those for, I don't know, a dozen years maybe. My neighbors are, as far as I know, unaware of the fact that I operate a business out of my home. And that's the way I want it. And I hope that, at least, especially in the case of a hosted, that it feels that way. In the case of unhosted, it's hard to imagine that they would actually not know. But to the extent that we could really minimize the impact, I think that would be a really good thing. Brian?
Well, I just wanted to support Jill's notion of the primary residence. I think that's a good way to think about it. I mean, I've rented out my house when we've gone out on vacation or something like that, and I wouldn't necessarily want to overly restrict somebody from being able to do that. And so I think that's kind of a good way to approach it. I hear concerns about how do you monitor and regulate the number of days and that sort of thing. But if it's somebody's primary residence, I think there's generally an inherent interest to make sure that, you know, somebody's not coming in and thrashing your primary residence or something like that. I mean, so I think I support that.
Thank you. Other comments?
No, I think you summed it up well. I just in listening to Jill's iteration of that, just to make sure that the things that I cared about tonight get the right emphasis. Yes, that the existing code beefed up for the right amount of fines and ultimately depriving the operator of their business license is something I'd like to see. And the concept of the responsible party as part of the definition of unhosted would, I think, go a long way to solving some of those problems. That is, you might have what we've been calling unhosted, but if there is a truly responsible party within minutes, even if it's not the owner of the place, that I think could be productive, could work for me.
I think that, yes.
We forgot one thing.
We wanted to address the parking again. You guys talked a few times about, it kind of went across the board about some in public comment as well, that parking's not an issue and someplace parking is an issue, and which is why we're looking to you for consideration and why we originally offered up a recommendation for one parking spot in the driveway, only because throughout the research of a lot of jurisdictions, some places don't have restriction for parking. Some actually allow for one vehicle per 2 persons per unit. So if you have a whole house or whatnot that's renting out 3 different rooms with 2 different persons, you've got 3 different cars. So in which case you could limit a lot of the on-street parking and residential parking. So that's why we look to you for what we can go for moving forward with that, but why we recommended maybe one spot in the driveway to limit that on-street parking and taking away visitor serving parking for those that are coming in to just park and walk to Poplar, so to speak.
Thank you for the reminder. It sounds like Brian has
I can think of, and from some of our speakers who are here tonight, some of our older homes in our leader park that don't have a driveway. They don't have any on-site parking now for the residents. And I can think of a number of situations like that. And actually, we're in those neighborhoods where the on-street parking isn't a concern. It's not necessarily really an issue if you had, another car on the street. So, so I appreciate the notion and support the idea of being able to provide one on-street parking. But I can just think of a number of situations that isn't going to comply with that.
So it's an exception, potentially. So it's a desirable idea, but maybe if there is no place, back to exception land. And we tried so hard to get away from that. So I love the neighbor that has the short-term rental in my neighborhood. I really love them, but all situations have complexities, and as a cautionary tale, in one case they rented, and they did not have that many people in the house. They brought in an RV that sat in the driveway. It was off street, but there were a heck of a lot of people. The party ran pretty late. I'm thinking it might have been within the noise ordinance, but it was lit. The neighbor, who's used to having a quiet, relatively quiet evening when the neighbor comes home, found that instead of being able to relax in a jacuzzi, she had attention from partiers. So it's not hard to visualize war stories about how these things work. And I'm not sure we can codify a lot of this, but one way to characterize it is, if you've upset your neighbors, then there's something wrong, unless your neighbor is just really difficult. And in this case, I don't think that was the situation. And it got fixed in later versions. So there are ways that sometimes you just have to have these experiences, and everybody smiles, and at some point they say, oh well, chalk it up to experience and things get better. And if there are ruffled feathers in the meantime, everybody's responsible for getting it fixed. That's what it means to be part of a community. But part of avoiding the situation where there's no reaction is to have the big stick that you were talking about. So with respect to parking, I support the idea. I think the more you can, a good neighbor policy indicates that we should try to accommodate visitors with off-street parking to the maximum extent possible. That's not just law, it's being a good neighbor. And if failing to do that on a consistent basis bothers your neighbor, then that's an issue that could be resolved administratively. So I think it makes sense to have a big stick and not necessarily to use it. Yes, Steve.
And if someone has no driveway, they should be allowed to contribute $100 to the Jules Sofer parking garage project.
An in lieu fee, nice, nice. So there was another one that you were looking for, did we get them? Colleagues, yeoman's work tonight, thank you very much for the attention. Public, yeoman's work tonight, thank you very much for everybody who commented. We'll consider this item finished for the evening, and somewhere in here I've got an agenda. It says that the next item on our agenda is the director's report. So off we go.
Very brief tonight. Your next meeting is February 11th. We have noticed a mixed-use project with a parking exception at 614 Parissima. It's a small project, and it's actually existing development with an addition. We are trying to get the housing element annual report to you. I'm not sure if we can have it ready February 11th. That said, we may need to cancel a February or a March meeting to give staff some time. We have so much code work going on back at the shop, and we just, if we have projects, if we have applicants, we'll bring them forward, but we need time to be working on our codes and our land use plan updates. So we will give you heads up on that. Let's see here. Council saw the accessory dwelling unit ordinance on January 21st. They continued to a date certain of March 3rd. We will keep you posted about their discussion. They were focused on the planned unit development zoning districts. Poplar Gateway's environmental review contract is going to be at their next meeting on, what is it, February, I didn't write it down, February 4th, I think. And the mixed-use zoning and parking is already going to them for first read at their very next meeting next week. Architectural Advisory Committee, we are preparing for them to see the Hyatt project. They were not formed in advance of when you saw that project through the notice of preparation, but we do really want to bring it through to them before you see the environmental impact report and the aesthetics analysis that will be in the EIR, as well as a discussion of visual resources. A couple of you are going to training. Thank you very much, and we'll just keep looking for opportunities for that, and that is all we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the director's report?
So I'm pretty sure I sent an email, but I will not be at February 11. Okay. Okay, great.
Okay, anybody else? How about Planning Commission communications? Anybody got anything they want to talk about? Therapy. Okay.
Move to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
We're adjourned. Thank you.